Alright, so for some reason that last video took forever to save. So I'm only going to have time to do one more tonight, but we're going to talk about Teddy Roosevelt. So his general approach towards progressivism is summarized by what we call the square deal. And it was called that because he was attempting to sort of treat everyone equally in an attempt to resolve problems. So he very frequently would get involved in direct debates between workers and employers. So one really key example of that was the anthracite coal strike of 1902, when Roosevelt actually called a meeting at the White House, I believe, between both union leaders, coal miners, and mine owners to negotiate a major resolution to a major strike that was taking place in that event. And think about how those events were treated by previous not administrations per se, but by previous governments and also by previous businesses, right? Their general go-to was to bring in the police, to bring in some sort of military force, maybe the National Guard, to try to break apart uh, any form of either civil disobedience or more violent confrontation. And also, I neglected to mention the very first point on this slide. He is also known for the three C's of progressivism: conservation and the control of corporations, as well as consumer protection. And we can elaborate on those as we go. By the way, I wanted to frame these around Teddy Roosevelt, but by no means should we just attribute all these reforms to Roosevelt himself. He just happened to be president when a lot of these things were taking place. Um, so this is sort of back to, I was going to say this is sort of back to socialism, but the legacy of Upton Sinclair is actually more about food reform. But Sinclair himself was actually a very active socialist in the United States, and I believe he was the child of Eastern European immigrants in the Midwest, Chicago, I want to say. And The Jungle was a book that was focused on the laborers who worked at a meat packing plant. And it exposed the really dire conditions of the industry. And this book was considered a form of what we call muckraking, which I summarized here as investigative journalism, but it's a phrase that more or less means um, to, if you think rake the muck, right, it's ultimately trying to expose some of the more corrupt elements of society. In this instance, the meatpacking industry, and also the unfair treatment and underpayment of the workers. And muckraking oftentimes brought certain issues to light. One could also say that Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives is a form of muckraking that may be uh, not necessarily labeled in that category. So, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act were direct effects of the jungle, as well as the muckraking surrounding the meat packing and food industries. The Food and Drug Act required all foods to be labeled subsequently, and the Meat Inspection Act required minimum standards for meat packing facilities, and they were inspected on a regular basis subsequently. Okay, so environmental conservation and preservation. It's important to at least just elaborate on the differences between the two briefly. Um, Conservation is the more traditional progressive approach toward environmental policy, whereas preservation was seen as a much more protectionist and much less political issue. So the most well-known preservationist was a fellow by the name of John Muir. You may have heard of him previously. And he ultimately, I guess one could summarize preservation as the desire to preserve land in its most pristine condition. And conservationists, however, wanted to still be able to utilize land, but also protect it from certain use. So, Teddy Roosevelt, for example, could be seen as much more of a conservationist. In fact, he could be seen quite explicitly as a conservationist, as we can see by his hunting habit down here below. So, some conservationist policies. In 1901, or rather, I'm sorry, in 1891, the Forest Reserve Act set aside 150 million acres of federal land as a national reserve that could not be sold to private interests. And then in 1902, the Newlands Reclamation Act provided money for the sale of public land for irrigation projects in the western states. And this is, of course, very significant to us here in Southern California because we know how significant and scarce water can be and how far water has to travel to get to certain destinations. In 1908, the government held a meeting to coordinate conservation planning. And this was a meeting that was, I said the government vaguely, it was both a federal and state effort. And it established the result of this meeting. The National Conservation Commission was established, and it created more efficient management of the nation's resources and ensured state cooperation with these programs. And it's important for us to realize that the National Conservation Commission was opposed by, at this point, it was President Taft who was in office, and the funding for this program stopped the next year. But nonetheless, Roosevelt, when he was president, set aside 148 million acres of forest reserves, and he also set aside 1.5 million acres of water power sites and 50 wildlife sanctuaries and several national parks. One brief further comment about conservation versus preservation. The Hetch Hetchy Dam. Not sure if you guys have ever heard of it. It's a dam of a part of the Colorado River. Really exhibits the debate between conservationists and preservationists, right? So, much like the Hoover Dam, the Hetch Hetchy Dam was an attempt to provide both water and hydroelectric power to a region that was scarce in both. And it was also a very pristine, beautiful part of the Grand Canyon, and it would be flooded with the creation of the dam. And so John Muir, the preservationist, argued adamantly against the construction of the dam. He argued dam Hetch Hetchy, dam spelled with the N. um, and ultimately, the dam was still built, but the preservation movement itself gained momentum as a result of this controversy here. Okay, so let's talk about Taft actually in this video too, because I think we have a little bit more time. Yeah, let's just get through that. So Taft. I have a question mark here because Taft, even though he was Roosevelt's successor for president, meaning that he was a Republican and he was Roosevelt's choice, ultimately, Roosevelt basically said that a vote for Taft would be a vote for the continuation of the Roosevelt progressive status quo. So, there was a pretty significant Republican support, enough to get him elected. Um, he also alienated many progressives when he was in office, and Taft ultimately was a one-term president. In terms of trust busting, he actually prosecuted almost twice the number of antitrust cases as Roosevelt. Most significantly, the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910 held that the Interstate Commerce Commission could suspend new railroad rates and oversee telephone, telegraph, and cable companies. And that's very significant because private ownership over these industries could result in some pretty dramatic price fluctuations. Conservation. The Bureau of Mines was established and it added more land to the National Forest Reserves and set aside federal oil lands, and that happened under Taft's watch, so he did continue some conservation efforts. And the 16th Amendment was ratified when Taft was president, although that was ratified by state governments, and that established a federal income tax. All right. Taft's reforms were criticized by some progressives, and there was ultimately a resulting split in the Republican Party. So, the Payne Aldrich tariff. Taft promised to ultimately lower tariff rates, but the Payne-Aldrich tariff ended up raising the rates on most imports. So it was sort of this added tariff, even though it was touted as a reduction of taxes. The Pinchot-Bollinger controversy. Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Bollinger, opened up lands in Alaska for private development. And Gifford Pinchot was chief of the Forest Service at the time, and he criticized Bollinger, and then Taft fired him. So that was seen as a significant controversy that gained a lot of criticism toward Taft. The House Speaker, Joe Cannon, many Republicans criticized him for being too dictatorial, but Taft did not respond to their demands, and so people were upset with Taft about this. And then in the midterm elections of 1910, Taft actually openly supported more conservative candidates for Congress in 1910, and this led to a clear split in the Republican Party between conservative factions that were loyal to Taft and a progressive faction that was more loyal to Roosevelt. And ultimately, Roosevelt ran for president against Taft in 1912 on his own third party, which was nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, seen as, Bull Moose is sort of seen as something that's both soft and strong. And you can see that even though he only he did not, well, I mean, he won a significantly higher amount of the electoral vote now that I'm re-examining this map after a long time. But still, even though he did not win nearly enough of the electoral vote, this is a significant electoral victory for what could be argued as a third party candidate, even though that was the only time that happened in recent history. Wilson's progressive policies. So let's talk a little bit about Woodrow Wilson next time, you guys, because for me, it's about 9 p.m., and that is my bedtime, and this is a good time to stop because then we can segue into World War I, and then we'll finish up for the Unit 7 flipped classroom slides. Sound good? All right. Thanks for watching. So long.